It's midnight in Paris. I'm Marco, and these are the main world news headlines. 1,000 and rising. The death toll in Mozambique is expected to increase as the scale of the damage caused by the cyclone becomes more and more apparent. Donald Trump tells Brazil's president that the sanctions on Venezuela could be tougher. Jair Bolsonaro met the US president face to face. They even swapped football shirts in the Oval Office. Pope Francis has refused the resignation of the Cardinal Philippe Barbarin. Citing innocence until proven guilty, Barbarin's appealing against conviction. A 6-month suspended jail term for ignoring child sex abuse committed by a priest under his authority in France. Thank you very much for being with us. The extent of the death and destruction in Mozambique is becoming more and more apparent. The death toll is expected to rise higher than the 1,000 that the country's president, Filipe Nyusi, has warned about. The deadly storm hit vast areas, the southeast Africa region still trying to count the full cost.
The storm may have passed, but the disaster is still unfolding. Flash floods continue to hamper rescue efforts in Beira, home to over 500,000 people, as well as the surrounding area. Up to 1,000 people may have died.
Speaking to colleagues on the ground, I think there's a view now that this is probably the worst humanitarian catastrophe to hit Mozambique in probably 20 years. Our team that arrived on Sunday found Beira, that had been a city that had been completely devastated, 90% of buildings severely damaged.
Winds of up to 194 kilometres per hour hit the port city when Ida made landfall last week. The storm caused flooding of up to 6 metres, creating an inland ocean. Roads were swallowed up into sinkholes and entire homes were washed away. Rescue workers have been trying to reach survivors who may be stranded on treetops and roofs. The flooding means sanitary conditions are poor. There could be risk of an outbreak of diseases.
For the immediate need, WHO is positioning health kits, emergency health kits, trauma kits, and also cholera kits in order to be able to assist people on the ground as soon as these kits get there.
Ida then moved on to cause landslides and heavy rains in neighbouring Malawi and Zimbabwe, where hundreds are missing. The UN said it was mobilising aid for 600,000 people, and China also pledged on Tuesday to provide aid relief to all 3 countries. Heavy rains are expected to continue, and the risk of further flooding is high.
Donald Trump has praised what he's calling the best ever US-Brazil relations. The US president was hosting his Brazilian counterpart in the Oval Office. The key development, a pledge to keep up the pressure on the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Trump telling Jair Bolsonaro that sanctions on Caracas could be a lot tougher.
Jair Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, both right-wing leaders, had voiced their mutual admiration from afar. In Washington, they repeated it side by side.
I've always admired the United States, but I admire it even more since you have become president.
One of the Brazilian president's announced goals, making Brazil a NATO ally without becoming part of the organization to enhance security cooperation. He got support for that and more.
I also intend to designate Brazil as a major non-NATO ally, or even possibly, if you start thinking about it, maybe a NATO ally.
Venezuela was another central topic. The U.S. and Brazil are strongly opposed to the country's socialist leader, Nicolás Maduro, and they have recognized his rival, Juan Guaido, as acting president. Trump called on Venezuela's military to drop Maduro so his government would collapse.
For Maduro, who is really nothing more than a Cuban puppet.
Trump said the U.S. could toughen sanctions on Caracas to increase pressure on Maduro. When asked if a military intervention is an option, the U.S. president replied,
"All options are open. I think of all possibilities. All options are open."
Next, mass protests in Algiers. Once again, thousands of people rallied, calling for the resignation of President Abdel Aziz Bouteflika. The protest leaders made an audacious statement calling on the army to keep out of the affair.
Marching for change on a symbolic day, tens of thousands of students, doctors and professors took to the streets of Algiers to call for the president's resignation on the anniversary of the ceasefire that ended the Algerian war.
We'd like to have a health system where the president can have a condition that's treated here instead of having to travel abroad. The current system is finished. It has to change.
Abdelaziz Bouteflika announced last week he wouldn't stand for a fifth consecutive term after his decision to run again triggered a wave of unprecedented protests in Algeria. But the president stopped short of resigning, saying he would stay in office until a new constitution was adopted and that he would postpone the elections. The move was interpreted by many as a way for Bouteflika to cling to power and to have a say in the naming of his successor. This fueled more demonstrations, with protesters now calling on the ailing president to step down immediately.
We have one demand: no extension. Only when this regime falls will we be represented.
After weeks of protests, leaders have begun to emerge from the movement, including prominent activists and opposition figures. On Monday, they issued a first public statement titled Platform for Change, in which they called for Bouteflika to step down and for the army to remain neutral.
Kazakhstan's President Nursultan Nazarbayev has unexpectedly resigned after 3 decades in power. Observers say it looks like the first step in a choreographed political transition that will see him retain considerable sway. Nazarbayev says that he wants to make way for a younger generation.
He's led Kazakhstan for almost 3 decades. In a pre-recorded televised address, Nursultan Nazarbayev announced that he had handed in his resignation, saying the nation needed a new generation of leaders.
Fellow citizens and supporters, I'm addressing you today as I've always done in the most important moments in the history of our state, which we are building together. But my address today is special. I have made the difficult decision to step down as President of the Republic of Kazakhstan.
There had been growing speculation about Nazarbayev's future, but his announcement on Tuesday still caught many by surprise, including its closest ally, Russia. Largely unchallenged since coming to power, the 78-year-old is the only president Kazakhstan has known since gaining independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. In 1990, he became the first secretary of the Communist Party and was elected president the following year. He's focused largely on economic reforms in the vast oil-rich country, which is the size of Western Europe and has a population of 18 million. He's been re-elected 4 times, most recently in 2015, when he won nearly 98% of the vote. But his popularity has arguably never been tested. The leader has resisted moves to democratize the Central Asian nation, and the conduct of every election has been criticized by foreign observers. He's helped attract billions of dollars from foreign energy companies and more than triple Kazakhstan's oil output. But he's faced growing discontent in recent years as the country faces a deepening economic crisis. A few weeks ago, Nazarbayev sacked the country's government, citing failures to improve the economy.
Christophe Castaner is resisting calls to resign over his handling of the Yellow Vest or Gilets jaunes protests. The French Interior Minister has been grilled by the Senate this Tuesday as business people are still counting the cost of the damage caused to their premises during the Yellow Vest protest last Saturday. Castaner took over at the Interior Ministry, replacing Jacques Collomb. In October, he resigned, of course, in the wake of the Benalla affair. Castaner has been defending police tactics and provisions in the face of criticism that officers stood by while rioters on Saturday ransacked shops, restaurants, and even burnt down a newspaper kiosk. The Paris chief of police was sacked on Monday.
The intelligence was correct, and our team of more than 5,000 police forces was substantial, so there wasn't a problem with advanced planning. We sent out clear and strict instructions. We wanted all actors to be punished, all violence to be interrupted. And I wanted it to be clear that we ought to have no hesitation in re-establishing order. When we look at the day's events, we can observe that this order was not carried out properly. There were failings that caused violence.
The controversy over the use of rubber bullet launchers led to inappropriate instructions being given to reduce their use. The mobility and the responsiveness of police forces, their intention to intercept the rioters, which was very useful in December, were lacking this time around.
So just to remind you, it's the 18th protest. It happened on Saturday. The violent pictures have been all around the world. And of course, Christophe Castaner, the Interior Minister, appearing before the Senate to answer hard questions as to how the policing has been carried out and as to how so much damage was allowed to be done. Observing this for France 24, our reporter Haxi Myers-Belkin.
The government made appropriate plans, but the police response was dysfunctional. During a grilling at the Senate this Tuesday, Interior Minister Christophe Castaner batted away calls for his resignation and defended the government's response to the latest round of Yellow Vest protests on Saturday. Christophe Castaner told senators that authorities were fully aware of how violent Saturday's protests were likely to become and that they deployed 5,000 riot police. Accordingly, things only got messy, he said, when police failed to employ the means available to them to quell the violence. He specifically referenced the use of controversial rubber bullet launchers that critics say are simply too dangerous to be used as much as they have been in recent months. Now, Christophe Castaner also said that the government was adapting to the changing face of the Yellow Vest protest movement. He cited the anti-casseur law that's recently passed both houses of parliament. He said that recent measures are designed specifically to target the most violent fringes of the Yellow Vest protest movement so that peaceful demonstrators can go about their business.
Haxi Myers-Belkin, our reporter there at the French Senate. Now, next, Pope Francis has rejected the letter of resignation handed to him by the Cardinal Philippe Barbarin, the Pope citing innocence until proof of guilt. Barbarin's appealing against a 6-month suspended jail term for ignoring child sex abuse committed by a priest who admitted the crimes, a priest who was under Barbarin's charge. So Barbarin's the highest-ranking French Catholic to be dragged into the child sex abuse scandal that is dogging the church worldwide.
A controversial decision by the head of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis refused to accept Philippe Barbarin's resignation as Archbishop of Lyon after the French cardinal was convicted of covering up sexual abuses in his diocese. In an interview with Catholic television Cato, Barbarin explained the Pope's reasoning.
He told me, "You've appealed the ruling and you're innocent until proven guilty. So if I accept your resignation, that means I acknowledge that you are guilty. And I can't do that."
Even the chairman of France's Bishop Conference expressed surprise at the Pope's decision, saying it created an unheard-of situation. Barbarin was convicted earlier this month of failing to report allegations of abuse in the 1980s and the 1990s. The cardinal said he would appeal the guilty ruling, but that he would step back from his job. Yet that wasn't enough to satisfy victims' associations, which reacted with anger at the Pope's decision.
It shows complete disregard for the Republican justice system. The Pope is committing a moral mistake, and I think he'll be responsible for the fall of the Church.
The Barbarin case comes as the Catholic Church faces a string of sex abuse scandals. The Vatican's former number 3, Australian Cardinal George Pell, was sentenced earlier this month to 6 years in prison for abusing 2 young boys. Meanwhile, Bernard Prenat, the priest whose abuses were allegedly covered up by Barbarin, is set to go on trial later this year.
And that's it for this bulletin, but stay with us, more to come here live from Paris.